This video will go over 10 spell cards that technically have positive effects. It's just, they are very underpowered in that they either don't do enough, or provide very minor benefits not worth going -1 over. At number 10, we have arguably the best card on the list, and that's Sparks. Sparks actually does 200 points of burn damage, which is the only card on this list that hurts the opponent in some way. Sparks is also the least amount of damage a burn card can do, outside of some burn cards requiring setup or relying on gamble effects, of course. In which case, some others can potentially do 0 burn damage. But good old Sparks will always do its 200 burn damage, and if you have a way to infinitely recycle this card, you could potentially win with Sparks. But pretty much every other burn card is better, and Sparks is so underpowered it could be considered a bad card. Number 9. Mooyan Curry. This card has the effect of increasing the life points of the targeted player by 200. Mooyan Curry is one of the few cards in the game which targets players, and it's also the least amount of life point gains a spell card provides, making it the Sparks of life point gain effects. But technically, gaining life points is a good effect, as it can be comboed with Dried Winds to also destroy an opponent's monster. Or if you have bad reaction to Samachi out on the field, you can target your opponent with its effect to do 200 points of burn damage. See, like I said, these cards do have positive effects, just not very good ones. Number 8. Hieroglyph Lithograph. This card has the effect of permanently making your hand size limit for the rest of the duel 7 instead of 6, at the cost of 1000 life points. This is one of the few cards in the game to just straight up change a rule of the game with its effect, and without needing to be on the field or anything. Once you use the card, you just have a bigger hand size limit from now on. Now, normally, this kind of hand size increase isn't really needed for any kind of meta or rogue deck, but it does have some useful applications, like if you're playing a big hand size deck with cards like Slifer, Muka Muka, or Tragodia, you can keep 7 cards in your hand at the end of your turn instead of 6 for more attack power, and without needing to rely on infinite cards being out on the field. Also in Duel Links, this card is used in some NPC farm decks, because in Duel Links, most PvE farm decks try to last until they have 0 cards in their deck for an end of duel bonus, and try to get their life points as low as possible for a low life point bonus. And this card helps with keeping the combo cards in your hand, as it's easy for your hand to get full in this kind of farm deck, and it helps lower your life points. So it's actually useful. Also, just a note, this effect only works once, so if you have multiple copies of it, you just make your hand size limit 7 again. Number 7. Recycle. This card has the effect of allowing you to put spell and traps back into your deck once per turn for a small life point cost. Seeing as this card puts them directly at the bottom of the deck, you could theoretically then draw the recycle card right away, if comboed with Convulsion of Nature or Goblin Circus. This top decking can also be useful for stacking good effect, terrible cost spells like Megaton Magical Cannon to combo with Diamond Dude. Or if you're running multiple copies of Treacherous Trap Hole, you can keep your graveyard clear of trap cards to make sure you can always use its effect. But here are some of the obvious downsides to this card that makes it underpowered. For one, its effect only activates during your standby phase, so you have to activate it and then wait a full turn before being able to use its effect once. In a game where trap cards are considered too slow for taking a turn to set up, this is mega slow. Also, on its own, it's almost useless, and its combo cards are not really worth the setup required. Using it with Goblin Circus to reuse spell cards every turn requires 2 specific cards to stay on the field and set up, and there isn't really a spell card worth all that effort to activate once per turn, over and over while giving up a draw phase. Its probable most useful applications out of the box is to recycle cards like Spell Power Graphs, Gather Your Mind, or Tune Table of Contents, spell cards that search each other out and run out eventually, or to maybe be able to run spells and traps in Super Heavy Samurai. Number 6. Abyssal Designator. At the cost of 1000 life points, you can declare a type and attribute, and your opponent must send one monster with both from their deck or hand to the graveyard. If you're playing against an opponent and you know what his key monster card is, you know they don't play other monsters with its type and attribute, and it actually might stay in the graveyard if sent there, like a Dark-Armed Dragon, then this is a good counter card. This is also a highly unlikely scenario, as most decks don't really mind their cards go into the graveyard, and play multiple copies of key cards, or have other cards with similar types and attributes in their deck. So it's a little underpowered in its intended use. But it can also be used for scouting, as if you declare a type and attribute that you know they don't have, or that doesn't exist, like Divine and Psychic for example, you get to check their hand and deck to make sure, which gives you all the information on their deck and hand at the same time. A feat few cards can do, which can then be comboed with your Mind Crush plays. Also in Duel Links, this card is often used alongside Hieroglyph Lithograph in farming decks to lower your life points for a bonus, with getting rid of cards that might disrupt your OTK later, like Spear KURIBOH. But in regular PvP Yu-Gi-Oh stuff, getting information on your opponent's deck, or even using it for its intended effect, are just not worth it for the most part. It's technically a positive effect, but there are a ton of other cards that get you information on your opponent's hand while doing other things. And you don't really need information on your opponent's deck. Also, as another sign of this card's underpowered status, there is an upgraded version of this card that came out recently, which, at the cost of 1500 life points, you can declare a type and attribute, and then make your opponent send a monster they control with the same type to the graveyard, with its effects suppressed for the rest of the turn, therefore bypassing destruction and preventing any kind of floating effects or other graveyard effects for the turn, which isn't half bad. Number 5, Seal of the Ancients. This card allows you to look at all cards on your opponent's side of the field, which means face down spells, traps, and monsters, all for the cost of 1000 life points. Knowing all the cards in your opponent's back row, and even face down monsters, is good information to have if you want to Twin Twister some problem cards. So it is technically a positive effect. It's just not really worth the fact that it does nothing else, which is something I'll repeat a few more times in this video. But this card is useful in Duel Link farming decks as well, for being a card that lets you pay life points basically, for the same reasons as Abyssal Designator or Hieroglyph Lithograph, but not really for its actual effect, and more for the fact that it lets you pay 1000 life points. Number 4, Kishido Spirit. This card has the effect that if your monster battles a monster with the same attack, it's not destroyed by battle. So its out-of-the-box usefulness is if you happen to have a monster with similar attack on the field as your opponent, and then attack into it to destroy it. Also, it protects your monsters while in defense mode, so if your monster gets changed to defense mode for some reason, and is attacked by a monster that just happens to have the same attack, it's not destroyed. And part of the reason this card is underpowered is because these situations don't come up very often in Yu-Gi-Oh! You rarely actually attack into a monster with the same attack, unless it's a mirror match or something. There are also a couple of cards that combo well with Kishido Spirit though, like Cat Ears Tribe, Copycat, or Mirror Mail, cards that allow you to match the attack of your opponent. But even with these cards, Kishido Spirit isn't really the best option for them, just a viable one. Number 3, the Inexperienced Spy. This card allows you to look at one card in your opponent's hand, basically at random, and then does nothing else. It's like a one-time, non-life point cost version of inspection. Technically, getting information on your opponent's hand is a good effect. It's just not really worth it unless it also does something else, which this card does not. It doesn't do enough to justify going -1 for its effect, despite technically having a positive effect. Number 2, Card Shuffle. Once per turn, you can pay 300 life points, then shuffle either yours or your opponent's deck. And you can only use this effect once per turn. Now, as for practical, positive uses of this card, If your opponent is stacking the top of their deck with cards like Plague Spreader Zombie or Field Commander Raz, you can shuffle their deck so they don't get to draw the card they wanted. Or if you don't want your opponent to know what the top card of your deck is because they're playing Spirals, you can shuffle your deck every turn to keep them guessing. Now, both of these scenarios aren't really worth running Card Shuffle over. I just wanted to show that there are some niche, positive uses of having on-demand shuffle power. In Duel Links, one of the characters has a special ability that is basically this card's effect, only for their own deck only. And even when it's not used as a card in the deck, and is instead something you can just do as a power, it's not used very often, except by hackers who can see the top card of their deck in order to reshuffle to get a better card next turn. Number 1. Ancient Telescope. This card allows you to see the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck. And that's it. You can't rearrange them or something. It's just pure information. Ancient Telescope was printed in one of the first sets of the game, alongside cards like Dark Hole, to give a little idea of the huge power difference in the cards. Dark Hole being a staple card that was banned for years, and Ancient Telescope being one of the worst cards with technically a positive effect. Ancient Telescope can be used for cards like Conscription, if you want to steal a monster from the top of your opponent's deck, or being comboed into a Mind Crush on their next draw phase to get rid of the card and potentially other copies of it in their hand. You'll notice this list has 3 cards whose sole purpose was to gather information on your opponent. Konami thought that would be a much more valuable thing than it turned out to be, seeing as all these cards are rather old as well. Not to say information isn't valuable, it's still really useful. Cards just need to do more than only gather information for them to be used, like with Spiral Gear Drone. Honestly, Card Shuffle could have easily been number 1 instead, but I have a softer spot for Telescope, as it was one of the first cards I owned with the Kaiba starting deck back in 2002, and I used to think it was such a good card back then. Alright, and that's it for the list. Any good underpowered cards I may have missed? Or maybe underpowered traps or monsters who technically have positive effects? I'd love to hear suggestions as well as ideas for future videos just like this one.